Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 3 of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Today, we're going to be looking at book 3 in the book. And if you got this video by a link, then I would invite you to open up also the handout that goes with this. And if you did not receive a handout, as always, you can request it from me at gmanning at concordunited.org. So I get ready to share my screen with you. I want to begin by looking at kind of where we were last week when we began talking and what we see as the book moves forward. Lewis has taken us back to a very broad look at the world where all possibilities, is there a God? Is there not a God? Is there more than one God? He kind of looked at the broad spectrum of things. And what we begin to see is that he's constantly narrowing us in from finally understanding there is a greater power, and then does this greater power have a name? And how does this greater power work? To then, how is it that we respond to this greater power? And it's that response where we are today. But before we get there, let's just do a quick review of last week. Last week, we understood that there was a difference between atheism or materialists, those who don't believe that there is any God of the universe, to those who believe there is a God. And if there is a God, then that God is the impetus, that's our moral center, our moral compass, if you will, that inner feeling of what we ought to do and what we not ought to do, that there's something behind that. And when we accept that, we also accept that we don't always still do what we ought to do, and we find ourselves doing what we not ought to do. I'm sure that's very poor grammar. But their ultimate solution to our errors was one who would carry them. And really what we're talking about now is, well, then how do we respond to a gift like that? So if those of us who are Christians recognize that there is an Almighty God, and when the Almighty God needed a way in order to cleanse us from our waywardness and to bring us back to wholeness, he sent his son. And his son, remember, made the columns equal for all of the sins that we had committed. He ultimately gave his life. So now what's our response to that? What is our response to that gift? And we ended with Lewis's words that said this: the Christian does not believe that the Christ life in him is merely something mental or moral. He knows that Christ is actually working through the cells, muscles, and fingers of his physical body. So then we move into an understanding from Lewis's perspective. Well, then what does that look like? And what is it that we're concerned about? And he uses the term that morality, Christian morality. And really, this whole book is actually called Christian behavior. And so he's going to turn it in, kind of make a change. Now, I need to preface this book because you get a clear understanding as you move into this section of the book, the difference between context and cultures of a person who was living in the 1940s in a time of war and people living today here into 2021. We're going to see some great disparities between how people thought in the 1940s and how they perceive things and how we perceive things today. But does it change the basic moral character of who we are? It should not, for we are finding our moral center in God himself. So, we begin to just ask ourselves the question, then how is it that we define morality? Well, when I asked my class that, some said, well, it's just knowing the difference between what's right and wrong. How is it that we make choices, and how is it that we make decisions? Lewis points out in his book that for in some people's mind, morality often means something that interferes or stops a good time, meaning that, every time you think about it, it's kind of like, well, maybe we should not be doing this particular thing. But he is trying to lead us in the direction that says moral rules are basically directions for running what he calls the human machine, meaning us as individuals and ultimately us as a society. And he said the thing about moral rules is that we may have some natural inclinations that differ from that, than what really is acceptable. And we're constantly trying to, if you will, mesh our natural inclinations with the moral directives that we get as followers of Christ. So what is it that we naturally want to do? And I was to say, naturally, we might want to be greedy. We might want to take more than we should. We might want to be boastful. We might want to be prideful. We might want to be lots of things that our morality says we have to tether that in and keep that natural instinct from taking hold. Because he says if we don't, in the long run, it's going to cause future problems. Maybe not just for us, but maybe for society as a whole. So let's say I don't want to watch what I eat, and I just want to eat all day long. I just want to just food is the driving thing that I have within me. And I just can't consume enough. I think about food. I have, just continue to do that. Well, as you all know, in the long run, I'm going to have some major problems when I don't take care of the body and feed it the way the body needs to be fed. Well, the same thing happens for us as a society. If we don't begin to think about others and how that's going to impact the greater good, then we're going to face future problems. So let's just take the idea of litter. If we all just said, well, I just need to throw my stuff out, or as a society, we begin to do that, what we begin to do is we begin to become a very trash filled nation, a nation that make, cannot dispose of its waste appropriately, then becomes a breeding ground for all kinds of other future problems, doesn't it? It was why we have environmental regulations about air pollution and why our cars have to meet certain standards, because we knew that in order to protect our environment, we had to do something that was bigger. So Lewis goes on to speak that there's what he estimates three ways that the human machine can go wrong. And the first way, he says, is when individuals go in different directions and drift apart or conversely collide with each other. And as an analogy, he uses the fleet of ships. He said a fleet of ships is, got a purpose. It's going somewhere for some purpose. But you can't just have one ship that goes off and goes, well, I think I'm just going to go over here and do my own things. Or it just decides that it can turn and go in any direction, even if it means colliding with someone else. Another example that he uses is that of a marching band. So let's say that, you can't have a marching band creating this beautiful formation and somebody out there just marching around doing their own thing, playing their own song. It would destroy the whole purpose of the band there. So one way is when one individual decides they're going to go off tangent, that they don't have to play, if you will, by the same rules that everybody else plays with. A second way, then, is when something goes wrong inside the individual. It's not that it's not just a matter of, well, I don't want to be obedient, but there's something intrinsically wrong with the individual, that they begin to see things from a different perspective. We've learned so much in the past when we talk about school shootings and things like this, of, those kids who feel like they don't fit in, and then they begin to turn inward and they begin to see things very differently. And ultimately, some call them the loner personality. They strike out then in order to defeat others who have given them this feeling. And, I think of the Unabomber or people, who do these kind of dastardly deeds. Sometimes there's something that's really gone wrong within them individually. And a third reason that individuals can go or human machines go wrong is if their purpose and is different from kind of what the greater purpose is. And they come up with another reason for everything that they do. I was telling my class yesterday, I think any organization, whether it be a church, whether it be a corporation, you can't have someone saying, well, I don't really like how the organization's going, so I'm just going to go off on a tangent and kind of do my own thing. Well, that would not work in a corporation, would it? Let's just say I'm working at the car dealer and I decide, I don't really want to sell cars here. I think I just like to, I want to I want to bring my crafts in. I want to sell my crafts here. I don't know what the vision for the company is, but I want to sell my crafts here. Well, of course, that's a silly example, but you see what I mean. But we also see it from a greater perspective. When we look at our nation and the vision for the nation, when you look back at our founder fathers and our documents, the document that says what? One nation under God. So, and we were many states, we still are many states, but we're even called the United States. Well, we begin to see, well, what happens when people don't see us as united? When one group of people decide they need one another way or see things in another a manner, and that everything that has been the guiding point for a nation begins to fall apart as coups and other things rise up. So it's not just in the United States, but any nation can see that. So we can see that the human machine goes wrong when its individual vision and the global vision of that organization, country, family, whatever goes awry, become in conflict. So he says, therefore, morality seems to be concerned with three things, and that is fair play within individuals as part of that. Now, most modern people will generally agree to this kind of standard set of fair rules. Let me take something as simple as a grocery store. I go into the grocery store and I have my buggy of goods. I'm ready to check out. I get in line behind other people. I don't go up and shove my buggy in front of them and go, you people aren't important. I can just do whatever I want to do. That would create anarchy in our world. And we know the outcome of things like that. But, fair play between individuals, generally, there's not a huge uproar about that we have that basic sense. But we're also have to understand how human beings work. What are the backgrounds? What's the raw material with which people come with? And how does that harmonize with the society's moralities? So how it is that I can get along with everybody else within that group. And then, the general purpose of the individuals as a whole, you know, uh, are we all on the same path, or are different belief systems colliding with one another? When we think about tidying up or harmonizing things within the individuals, if we don't do that, then that's where we see greed and oppression and cowardice and conceit and bad tempers. All those things arise out of that. Now, this is what Lewis has to say about this. He says, if one believes himself to be the landlord of his own ship, his mind and body, he will not avail himself to God's purposes. On the other hand, recall that Christianity asserts that every human individual is going to live forever. If this is true, even if a state of union or nation lasts 1,000 years, the individual is still not only more important, but incomparably more important. The significance is this: whereas my bad temper may not be much to bother about if I'm only going to live 70 years, in 1,000,000 years, it could gradually become an absolute hell. So he says we have to start within ourselves. We do have to start within ourselves and find that thing that makes us centered in our own morality. Another way to look at it is just like this. He says, "What are our relationships between man and man? But what is the relationship within ourselves, and what is the relationship between man and the power that made him?" So if we kind of look at this maybe in a reverse order, the power that made us created us, and we need a relationship with him. We need a healthy relationship, understanding of who we are. And from those two, then we go out and we have healthy relationships, man to man. So that's what we're talking about morality. What is it like when we try to get along within ourselves? What does it mean to get along, be obedient to the higher power, which we perceive as God? And what does it look like in our behavior when we get along with one another? Now, there's another, as we move to the second chapter of this particular book, he said another way that we can look at morality is to divide it up by the seven virtues. Now, three of the seven virtues are called theological virtues, and four of which are called cardinal virtues. And it reminds us that the word cardinal has nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church. Cardinal means hinge, meaning it can go one way or the other. Which way do we want our virtue to swing? If there's a spectrum, if you will, a scale upon which we can look at those things. And the cardinal virtues, we'll talk about the theological ones later, but the first of which is prudence, which means common sense, or taking the trouble to think out what you're doing and what the consequences are going to be. And so, it matters what we do. And so it matters how the consequences of that particular behavior. And so it doesn't mean that we just have to be childlike in every way, that we need to be able to think with our mind, to reason. Sometimes we may think that common sense is not so common anymore, that people have lost the ability to think through what they're doing. And so he says, but the mind and the heart cannot be in disharmony with one another. So he says, we want to have the heart of Christ to do what heart desires, but we also have to think with our mind of what does that look like and what are the consequences of that. One of the things, expression that he uses in the text, he said, we need a child's heart, but we need a grown-up's head. And so we have to align those two things. What does it mean to think about what we're doing and what the consequences will be? The second virtue is temperance. Now, we've taken this word and we've tied it to the temperance movement or teetotalism, abstaining from alcohol. But really, temperance means to temper everything, that nothing should be in excess. So there's a goal from being abstinent to being excessive. And somewhere in the middle is this word temperance. But if we lean too far from one side or the other, then the virtue gets messed up, doesn't it? So it's like too much exercise, too much food, too much sex, too much entertainment, too much of anything can derail us in our moral stability. But kind of going too much the other way, not having any, can also lead us into judgmental statements. And then we turn into hatred and defiant and judging what other people are doing. The third one is justice. And in justice, we mean more than what goes on in a court of law. We are talking about fairness, including honesty, truthfulness, and keeping promises in this. Now, you will recall that we've talked about in other times, we talk about part of the problem with the Pharisees is they had lost the idea of justice. The law was everything, but they didn't take into any account, well, what's fair, what's honest, what's truthful, what does make common sense, as we go to keep these promises. So justice and law are two different things. And then the final is fortitude, which includes two kinds of courage, the kind that faces danger and the kind that endures pain. Now, it's not the absence of fear. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is going on with strength to face those particular fears, what we might call as perseverance or so forth. And that is true for pain. It just means that we're going to seek to be persevere through pain, through hardship, that we're not going to surrender and succumb to being victims of those things. So what he goes on then to talk about, well, then some people do virtuous acts, but the people aren't virtuous. Well, how can that be? If I'm acting virtuous, why am I not virtuous? And so he puts it this way. If you do right actions, but for the wrong reasons, then you're not building the internal quality or character called virtue. All right, so let's take one person yesterday in our study gave me this example. So there's people who go to church, they talk with everyone, but they go to be seen and to do that, but they really have no interest in growing deeper in their faith. They have no interest in worshiping God, right? So let's say I learn that someone is sick, and I think, well, I'm going to go take them a dish and then I'm going to tell everyone what I've done, how compassionate and caring I was. And so I want to make sure that it is known that I did this act of kindness. Now, both of those things can be virtues, though, can't they? If I go to church with the purpose that I'm going to praise and worship, and it's really not about me, but it's about God and my service to God, or I take a meal because I have pure compassion for the people and I want to make sure they're fed, it has nothing to do with me, then we can see that there's a difference between those two. And there are many times where right actions are done for the wrong reason. I'm going to give a great deal of money and I want to make sure that my name appears on the donor card and preferably on the building. Then everyone knows what a great donor I am, versus doing things maybe in privacy or silence, which is what Jesus spoke about. He says, when you do things, don't boast of them in the city streets. And he says, God does not want a simple obedience to a set of rules. I'm following all the rules, but I'm not being transformed by them. so that I have to keep thinking, well, I've got to do this because it's following a rule instead of doing it because it is now within a part of my Christ-like character that I do those things. And there we see the downfalling of the Pharisees. And finally, virtues have value beyond this life, that we keep trying to become more virtuous, more Christ-like, because we want to be Christ uh, um, ambassadors here upon the earth. But we also know that that is where we want to be met when we enter heaven's gate. We want to know what that prolonged happiness of walking with God looks like and feels like. Now, one of the texts that I'm using is to also talk about this is a study guide. And the author of the study guide, he says, well, we can take these seeming like what seem like old terms. We don't hear people talking much now about temperance or prudence. He said, but if we move these into more modern terms, we might perceive prudence as the word wisdom or temperance as self-control. Are you beginning to hear hints of the fruit of the Spirit here? Justice would be righteousness, being right with God and doing what's in keeping with God. And fortitude would be that beautiful Pauline word of perseverance. And so when we look at these words, that we're being asked as virtuous people to use our wisdom, to practice self-control, to seek to live in harmony with what God asks us to do, and to persevere knowing that the battle may be mighty for within us and outside of us in order to continue to do that. So he says, the first thing to get clear as we move now into chapter 3, and it's called social morality. And he says the first thing to get clear about Christ and Christian morality is that Christ did not come to preach a new morality. Christianity does not have a detailed political program laid out. It's meant for all men at all times, and the particular program which suited one place or time would not suit another. And so, we have to, understand that um, sometimes we think, well, there's some new rules out there. But what did Jesus say? He said, I didn't come to do away with the law. I came to extend the law, as part of that. Now, I will say that at this particular juncture in the writing of C.S. Lewis, let's go back to think we're in World War II. Well, a lot of the criticism was coming out at the church that the church was not doing enough in order to stop what was going on in terms of the Nazi invasions and the taking, particularly of the Jewish people. And so what he's saying is that the same morals have been there, should be there for every generation to protect human life. So the church doesn't have to come up with a new set of morals. But what we began to see is that the people were looking at the leadership of the church and defaming them because they weren't doing enough. But the reality is the church is a building. It is, but the congregation inside is the action that comes out from that center that we call the church. So it's not just leaders, but all people were being called in order to stand up, to step up, to do what was necessary. And so you begin to see people doing that as we read stories of people who were hiding Jewish people, who were covering for them, who were enabling people to get out of Europe at that time in order to be protected. So he says the right way for the church should give us a lead in social morality involves the whole body of practicing Christians, whereby we use specific talents that each person has. And the wrong way is for the clergy to initiate some kind of political movement. All right, so let's look at that. Let's take it right now within our country, race relations. Now, if someone can stand from the pulpit and they're not telling you anything new, for God said that he loved all the world and that we're to love our neighbor, it's not a new morality. That's what it is. And our neighbor, he doesn't define. It's everyone, right? Everyone is our neighbor. Because when they asked Christ that, he gave them the parables and showed them who is your neighbor. Everyone is your neighbor. So when we come to that, we're not giving you a new morality from the walls of the church. What we're saying is whatever occupation, wherever you may find yourself, are you practicing that morality code? Are you loving your neighbor in the grocery store? Are you loving your neighbor as you teach? Are you loving your neighbor as you go about your work and are with coworkers? Wherever you are you practicing that? And like I said, in World War II, we saw people doing that, stepping up, speaking out in order to protect others that they might be in line with the morality that was being in Christ. Today, we see the same thing when we see people speaking up, speaking out in an effort to end some of the racial divisions that separate us to this day. And so, it comes back to if you want to know what morality looks like, then look at the teachings of Christ as found in the New Testament. He never distinguishes between which men that you should do this with, which people should you feed, which people should you clothe, which people should you house. He says, greater love than this. And we do it for all of God's people. So there's not a new morality, it's the morality that's always been in place, and it will stand with whichever is going on at the time. And that's what he's speaking about. And so it's not the leadership of the church that needs to institute what Christ has already taught, but all people, the leaders and the congregation, the disciples of Christ, wherever they may find themselves, are called to lead in social morality. One of the things that he says that we don't do well, though, when it comes to this idea and moving from the church out and from Christ's teachings out, is the whole idea of usury. He mentions that, in scripture, it says you're not to charge interest to others. And, and it's interesting that part of the impact in World War II was that the Jewish people that had a lot of the banks and they were causing people interest, they were gaining money, and that was creating part of the hatred that people had against them at that time. But he says, and he kind of goes on to list, if you will, pros and cons of both. He says, it stimulates the economy and it gives individuals a place so that their money works for them. But then there's the other side of that coin. It can lead to credit failure amongst people who overborrow, overspend, and it can lead to greed and oppression of people who end up charging, too much money. And so he says, that whereas the Bible is firmly critical of usury, which is really disadvantageous lending, that you could not possibly begin to pay back. And so he wants to make sure that we distinguish between that. And so, and even Christ himself rebuked the guy for bearing his money and not making it earn something. And so when we're talking about this, he says, even in that, we need to be moral in how it is that we charge people. I recall once years ago, I worked for a bank in town when I was in college and first out of college. And, I would sit on the lending board where they made the decisions about who was going to get a home loan and who was not. And there were some very immoral things that I learned sitting at that table of how certain people ended up paying more cost than others based upon their economic ability. It was always odd to me that those who were highly professional and in highly professional firms or occupations often were charged less in closing fees than the poor young couple that was starting out just trying to get their first home. And so you begin to see that that would have not been a good moral example. We saw that certain classes of ethnicities got more favorable treatment than others did. And so those are the kind of issues which Jesus would have taken exception to when it comes to social morality. He also identifies that giving to the poor is the essential part of Christian morality, that's always supposed to be a part of who we are. And he said, there were people arguing at the time, basically, well, that if they're not willing to get out and work, then we shouldn't, help people in any kind of way. And so, and we still hear that same argument today amongst people. And one of the things that he's, really cautioning us against is the fact that we don't really know all of people's stories. We don't know their background. We don't know what has led them to this particular point. And so the conversation is, let's come back to the childlike heart, but the grown up head is how do you make wise decisions in terms of charitable giving? And, I know for my husband and I, what we do instead of often giving money to individuals is we give money to organizations who are equipped to help people through various life struggles and challenges. And knowing that, they're going to vet and make sure that the money's going for the purpose for which we intend it to, to be given. And then he comes down to, well, then how much money should you give? And it's an important point. He says, if you're giving out of abundance and it really is no sacrifice to you, then maybe you're not giving enough. And it's a measure. And I know oftentimes, we tell people, and one of the things we speak of in biblical language of giving is it's the first. It comes out, that tithe, that gift, whatever comes out, then the expenses, and then whatever's left is left for pure enjoyment. But it's not an afterthought. It's not, well, if there's any money left over, then we'll do that. And so given to the poor. But he says what happens is most of us draw up a blueprint for Christian society, and then we go out and look for people who support our view. Well, you shouldn't give to them. You should only give to this. You shouldn't do this. And he says what we're really looking for is not a master, someone who speaks within us through the Holy Spirit as to what we should and should not be doing. But we're looking for someone who judge and goes along with what we think is right instead of listening and looking back to what God says is right. And he said a Christian society is not going to arrive until most of us really want it, and we're not going to want it until we become more Christian. And so the whole idea and the thing he's summing up here with social morality is if all we begin to think about is ourselves and we don't give out as need be to help our society in whatever way possible, whether it is in trying to diminish prejudice, whether it is in trying to alleviate poverty, whether it is in just coming alongside of people, if we're really not willing to invest in that, and it's all just verbiage, then we'll never be the society that we want it to be. We'll be the society that says someone ought to, and we never look in the mirror to see that maybe we're the someone who ought to. Well, as we leave this chapter, Lewis kind of spins in a different direction, but he spins in a different directions really for a very good reason. And this chapter was called Morality and Psychoanalysis. And at that time, Freud and Jung were really big psychologists who were developing a lot of ideas about mental behavior, mental health, and they were more psychologists than they were psychoanalysts people, meaning that a psychoanalysis tries to change human behavior, to face whatever is holding them back and to move them forward. Psychology's understanding why the human mind does what the human mind does and how it thinks. And so there was a great challenge going on at that time because part of the psychological field and part of psychoanalysis is that the subconscious is this thing that operates within the human machine, and it is what is determining what people do and do not do. In other words, it's overruling the free will that people have, that even though we want to do this, the subconscious is keeping us from doing what we freely want to do. And so this is how it's noted in the book. Many of his contemporaries argue that Freud's belief in the unconscious, a part of the mind that influences human decision-making without betraying its presence, contradicted the Christian belief in the doctrine of free will. In short, if there is a silent and visible part of the mind that influences our choices, then can we really say that our choices are free? Well, you can see where people were trying to decide this, like there's something that's even deeper than the free choice that God has given people. And so Lewis will argue that really it is not contradictory. He says that Christianity is the act of choosing what to do, and there's two steps to that: weighing various thoughts and feelings, and second, translating these into an explicit choice or action. So to make sense to us, so say that my subconscious says, well, you just need to go over there and take that toy from that child. But he says I still have the choice, even though the subconscious may be urging me to do this. My free will says I can do that thing or not do that, and whatever I decide will be the action that I take. Thus I still have free will. So wherever the idea populates from in my mind to do or not do something, he says that I still have the ability to do that. So, whereas psychoanalysis seeks to remove the abnormal psychological fear and give a man better raw material for his act of choosing, morality is more concerned about the choices themselves. So he says, still, no matter where the idea comes from, how we choose is the basis of our morality. So he uses an example. Let's say that there a group of soldiers, and one is terrified of going into war. He's got a lot of childhood traumas that have made him very fearful, and he really has no courage to go forward. So, in psychoanalysis, they would work with this particular man. They would help him deal with his childhood traumas. And now he may have more confidence and courage to go into war, recognize that he's doing so out of duty. Now, someone else might go through the same kind of thing, but when they come out of it, they're going to say, well, I don't really care anymore about fighting with my comrades and protecting my country. What I want to learn how to do in psychoanalysis is just how to save myself. So, they're all now, quote, better equipped for battle, but one is thinking only of himself, how to basically throw his team under the bus, and the other is how can I be the best soldier that I can be. So they're both made of choice, though, right? I'm in it for myself, or I'm in it for my fellow soldier. And so you can see that even though there was a lot of things going on in the mind, ultimately, why did you choose the choice I chose? Is it greed, self-interest, or is it in keeping with the betterment and good of society? But he recognizes that sometimes our psychological material is not in sin, but there is a disease. And he says it does not need to be repented of, but to be cured. So this makes us step back and to recognize with full throttle attention that sometimes people act in ways that they honestly cannot help themselves because they have a mental illness. And mental illness, he said, is not a sin. Now, remember, when you go back into Old Testament, in particular reading, even into New Testament, with Jesus, when Jesus went and cast the demons out of the man and threw them into the pigs, or he would report somebody having a seizure or leprosy. Many people in those days thought that you had lived a sinful life, and therefore that is why you had that particular affliction. Like the man born blind, did he sin or did his parents sin? Was the question asked of Jesus. So, we've gone a long way, I hope, in dispelling that anything that happens to us is not because God is mad at us, that we're out of relationship with God in terms of our physical affliction. And to recognize that what some people do is truly mental illness. And we can equate many things in our modern day when we see heinous acts. We often see a very mentally ill or deranged person doing that. So someone asked me in class, then did I think that people were born evil? And my response, and I stand by it, is I don't know that they're born evil, but I think they can be formed into evil because of circumstances, backgrounds, traumas that we cannot even begin to fathom at some point. Where did things in that life go? And it could have even been in utero, where with the mixing of certain genetic materials that we begin to see things misshapen. We know that, when siblings, if siblings were to have relations and produce a child, we know there's going to be distortions, most likely deformities into that body. Well, over time, we have to look at those things and what is the dynamics that have created people. And so he says we have to be careful because we as humans judge people based on external actions, but God judges based on moral choices, not the raw material. And so when we come back to, we have ultimately, that's ultimately saying we have to leave God to cover that, to understand that. What's our responsibility in the midst of that? Well, I think sometimes when we're with people who have uh, big capabilities to bring harm, we do have to set boundaries for ourselves. That doesn't mean we have to hate the child, to hate the person, become bitter with the person. We just have to come to an understanding that some of the choices they make are because of that particular mental illness. Um, and he says, putting that aside, but coming back to, behavior, he said, every choice we make, not every rule we keep, is turning the central part of ourselves, that part of choice, into something a little different. And he says, we either decisively decide we really want to make choices that are leading us into a closer relationship with God, or we're going to make choices that bring us into a hellish war with God. What is it that we want to do, and what are the choices that we ultimately want to make? He says, going in the right direction leads not only to peace, but also to knowledge. Lewis states that when a man is getting better, he understands more and more clearly that evil has left him, is still left in him. When he is a man getting worse, he understands his badness less and less. A moderately bad man knows he is not very good. A thoroughly bad man thinks he's all right. Good people know about both good and evil. Bad people do not know about either. So let's say, at some point you made a choice to commit a crime, and then, you rationalized that you committed the next and committing the next. So finally, you don't see anything wrong with what you're doing. You think it's all perfectly fine what you're doing. It's other people. And so that's what he means. The truly bad person has lost all identity of what is right and has made this choice. But the more we try to be right and do right, the more we understand what we not ought to do. And so that is the summation of that particular chapter. We're going to finish today with chapter 5, which is on sexual morality. And I will tell you that it is, to this day, one of the most controversial chapters in the book. And the sexuality morals of the 1940s and the 19 and then 2021 look very different. And it's interesting that as Lewis kind of goes into this particular chapter, he begins to see that some of the standards that they inherited in the 1940s would seem outdated or puritanistic to them. Well, you could imagine if he were to come back 80 years later and just say, well, wow, it's really, really different now, isn't it? And so I don't want to get into a lot of that discussion because I think there's a lot of sexual morality issues that we're dealing with. I just want to look at it from this book's perspective. And he does go on to speak that Christian morality regarding sex is called the virtue of chastity. Now, and that is that he says the rule of chastity is the same for all Christians. However, the rule of social propriety has changed from one society to the other. So chastity is that understanding that we have within us a thing of value, and that is our protection of our sexual selves, and that we need to use it. And I come back to that word temperance, that cardinal virtue, that that it is something to not be overused, underused. It is to be used for the purposes for which it was created. But it has an emotional impact to us. It has a mental health impact to us. Our chastity does. Now, social propriety will change over time. I just look at church. When you used to, women never wore slacks in church. When I was in high school, you could not wear slacks to school. Girls were not permitted to do that. It was socially improper. Thankfully, that changed in my high school years. But you see that things that we said as proper change over time. And if you go back a day when women were going to charm schools or finishing schools or whatever, and they were told what was proper and what was not, young men were guided in the same direction. And now, if you took a child and took them back to the 1950s and said, this is how you're supposed to act, they would think we were from Mars. They could not begin to understand that. And so you see the difference between the two. But the thing with Lewis's writing that makes this chapter difficult is he seems to believe that society must choose between two extremes: constant sex and sexual perversion and Christian chastity, and that there's a compromise between these two just doesn't seem to come up. And so he's kind of giving us both ends of the spectrum. And he almost comes down to saying, and of course, he acknowledges in the book he's not a married man, but he comes down to, within the book of saying, that, you're either totally into all the perversions and sexual activity or you're into none. And where's the middle ground within that? That that, of course, humanity was given sexual pleasure, that yes, it is a procreation tool, but God also gave it to us as a tool of intimacy, of closeness, of drawing near to one another. And he also would speak of monogamy. However, you remember in the days of Jesus, people were still marrying many wives and things. And so if, we, throughout the centuries have confined it to a monogamous couple, that you're devoted to one another. And so in sexual activity is to be held within the bounds of that, as, so that there's not adultery. It's interesting, in the Old Testament, adultery was perceived very differently than we do now. A man who was married could go have relations with any other unmarried woman. But if you were married, as a married woman, you could not do that. So it's a very different standard. So when we talk about that, when we speak of adultery, we speak of it's improper for either party of a union to be going out with other people. And so he really doesn't address, those particular things. And so, he says, well, some of this, he said in retrospect, as we look at this about normalizing sex, he says, just make sex more of a mess. And so he says, every time we try to normalize it, we make a mess of it. Well, you could imagine him coming back now to the 21st century. And we would look back upon his generation as saying that they were repressed and ignorant about sexuality. Lord knows what he would say about ours. But I think the ultimate message that he really delivers to us is one that is true throughout the time and space. He said, sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad. Of the animal self and the diabolical self, the diabolical self is the worst. Judging is worse than falling to one of our physical desires. A cold, self righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it's better to be neither. Well, we can laugh at in many ways. I think it's kind of said with a touch of tongue in cheek when he's speaking. But, in this idea of bad or less bad or whatever, I think is an irrelevant point at the moment. But it comes down to the very three things we talked about with morality. You know, one is, how is your relationship with God? And God has created you as a pure, wonderful vessel to hold his Holy Spirit. The body is a temple, he tells us. How are we using that body in order to glorify the temple in which God dwells there? And how is it then that we make peace within ourselves of what we're going to allow this body to be subjected to, how it is to be used? And when we look from that man to man, human to human contact, what is the respect that each of us needs to give to one another in relationship to our sexual morality? And that's why we, would never, we want we don't want abuse, any kind of sexual abuse is inappropriate. And to see what was it that God wanted this to be. And really, how have we sometimes changed that around? And have we taken chastity and made it such a defined rule that we made it impossible for humanity to keep? And when I look at some of the scandals within the Catholic Church, and this, demand that the people within there abstain from all things, we've seen the outgrowth of that. That was kind of an unnatural um, action that was being required of people in order to maintain that rule. But it led to things that were breaking a far deeper rules, which was that infliction upon others of activities and unwantedness that came upon them. And so, I think we come back to those three things. What do we believe that God asks of us? How do we see our bodies as a temple of his Holy Spirit? And what is it that we permit and don't permit within us? And does anything that we do separate us from his will for us? And then that self-respect that we have for one another when it comes to any idea of what's sexually moral, and that is to be that decision between the two of them, that one is not taking advantage of another in any way. So that's a difficult chapter. Like I said, from a sexual moral standpoint, There's a lot of differences now between 1940s generation and others, but at the same time, though, I think we can all return to a common center that regardless of time, 1940 to 2021, those three principles about what is moral with God, within ourselves, and with humankind should stay the same regardless. So that's where we're going to end today. Next week, we will finish book three, which we'll be looking at the last seven chapters about that. And so we want to we'll be looking, I think it's chapter 6 through 12, I believe is what we'll be covering next week as we finish book 12, still continuing our conversation on Christian behavior. So I hope that you'll join me, and I appreciate you being with me for this particular session of Mere Christianity. See you next time.